team and then community members that we've worked with on the ground, and tell you a little bit about what our roots are prior to March 2020. So like many of us here, I mean, I think all of us here, I grew up knowing the importance of water, and especially being from a sovereign nation within one of the world's richest countries with high concentrations of water poverty and water contamination. This includes things like uranium and arsenic, which are naturally occurring. Oftentimes, there were many mines on the reservation that weren't cleaned up, and that affects our surface and groundwater and has caused many residents to not only get sick, but unfortunately pass from things like kidney failure and cancer. That's where my passion lies in water, because having lost family members to things like uranium, it really set me on a path to fight for others who didn't have the luxury of having running water. I grew up in Tuba City, Arizona, which is on the western side of the reservation, and it's where I live half the month with my dad to do the work that we do. But, my background is in the arts as a commercial art director, a commercial gallery director. And, I hit a certain point in my life where I realized that this was the work that I wanted to do. However, I never thought, and I don't think my team ever thought, that we'd be doing relief work like pictured here. As I mentioned, my relationship with water has changed yet again. And I think during these past months, my understanding of just how precious it is has grown even deeper. Seeing firsthand what can potentially happen when you don't have access to safe, clean drinking water during a pandemic has made me realize just how important it is that we work to ensure that all have access. Native nations are often hit the hardest about water poverty, and it's really important that we come together and make sure that that doesn't happen. But I also want to mention that there are almost 2 million Americans who don't have piped water in their homes. So again, I arrived at this point where I constantly think about water, again, like everybody else on this call and everybody else on this presentation. It's been a pretty intense and honestly sometimes emotional journey working back home on the reservation, where 30% of Navajos do not have running water. And as I mentioned, I really need you to think about this picture that when you don't have running water, it is not possible to shelter at home, as you're constantly having to leave your house to haul or purchase water. And oftentimes we're seeing that families come in contact with others who are living off the reservation, where there are currently higher cases in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And, when you don't have running water, you can't properly wash your hands for the recommended 20 seconds. When you have to use things like bottled or hauled water, using 20 seconds of water can be a pretty big burden. We're told to do both of these things, which is stay at home and wash our hands. And that's something that just simply was not happening on the Navajo Nation for the 1 in 3 Navajos who did not have that luxury. Earlier at the end of last year and earlier this year, there was closure of NGS, or the Navajo Generating Station. And that meant that a lot of Navajos lost their jobs. And then in addition to the pandemic, more people were hitting unemployment. And so oftentimes people didn't have money for gas to go to watering points. They didn't have the time taking care of family members, or even now with students working at home, to go and get water. And this has just been such a huge thing. And on top of it, it's been an extremely dry summer. And so many watering points have dried up. So as I mentioned, I want to give you a little background about what we've been doing prior to March 2020. I think some of you are familiar with our work, so I'll just give a brief overview here. So the bulk of our work is installing what we call home water systems. And these are off-grid systems, which I'll give you a breakdown here afterwards, what goes into them. But we've done 276 of these systems throughout the Navajo Nation in 3 primary areas. You'll see here that it says that we partner with 10 chapters, which are local government on the Navajo Nation, and 1 nonprofit. And those are actually, the western side of the Navajo Nation on the border of Utah and Arizona, and then the eastern side So we actually went from doing 3 locations to tens of locations, which again, I'll get into afterwards. But, you know, it's definitely something that you can see from this map. If the Navajo Nation were a state, we'd be the 10th largest. We're huge, but this water issue exists throughout the Navajo Nation. A home water consists of some pretty basic elements. We have an underground cistern that has to go underground. I think a lot of people think, you know, in the desert, it's really hot, but it does get very cold, especially because we're at such high elevations. And so we need to make sure that the tanks are protected, especially from freezing. That's actually an issue that we've had to engineer a lot over the past couple of years, is how to protect these systems from freezing up and not working. And it's a pretty simple series of plumbing that's brought in by a pump. One big element of DigDeep's work and the Navajo Water Project's work is making sure that there's heated water. And then there's a particle filter, one sink, a gray water drain field, and what we do are monthly water deliveries, which is something that we've continued to do throughout the pandemic. We have 2 different types of systems, one that runs on grid electricity, and then one that runs on solar power panels. So the power that, you know, it being a desert, again, it's pretty sunny. And so the systems that are solar powered are a little bit different. There's a different pump. When we first started the work, I think we had planned out for many families having grid electricity, but that wasn't the case. So like, obviously the entire world, everything shifted for us basically overnight. There's been a lot of work, including our team and I, shifting the project from doing these long-term home water systems, and again, 3 main areas on the res, to doing relief and emergency work, again, basically overnight. And now, as I mentioned, we're working in tens of communities across the Navajo Nation. There's been a lot of trial and error, a lot of adaptation, and honestly, a lot of loss. And that's been the hardest. We went from having the highest number of cases per capita in the United States to lowering our numbers significantly through doing things like having weekend lockdowns, nightly curfews, and making sure that just everybody was staying at home, closing public spaces, which I think for many cultures is a really hard thing to do when you're having such significant loss. We've lost almost 600 people on the reservation. There have been almost 13,000 cases, but you know, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're in 3 different states. And so we have major highways passing through our reservation, and that can really contribute to it. But I mean, the journey really hasn't been all negative either. There's been a lot of new relationship built, a lot of learning from others, and a lot of collaboration leading to new projects, which I really want to tell you about. So the first one here was definitely the first step that we took in doing the relief work. We received this massive amount of bottled water donation, and we worked with almost 20 different locations. We partnered with people who were on the ground, which was something that we haven't done before, working in this capacity, working with different tribal entities, federal government entities, working with community health representatives, and we made sure that we distributed this water, which served almost 30,000 people. Bottled water is not a sustainable solution. It obviously creates waste. It's not something that we wanted to do long-term and solely throughout the pandemic, but it was definitely something that needed to happen immediately. Again, we needed people to shelter at home. On the reservation, there are only 13 grocery stores. And, you know, with weekend lockdowns, oftentimes people weren't able to get there in time to purchase water. And so what we did was, when teaming up with all of these people, we made sure to prioritize COVID positive patients, those who are high risk, our elders, which are some of our most precious community members and, you know, keepers of our culture, single mothers, veterans, and people who are living extremely off grid. Like I said, this was just the first step. And so we realized that we needed to transition into something a little bit more long-term. And so our team and I met, we discussed what we wanted to do. And the next step that made sense was something that was sort of in the middle between our 1,200 gallon home water systems and the bottled water. And so we came up with the idea of installing above ground, which has also been interesting to figure out the freezing again. above ground 275 gallon storage tanks. And those are these square tanks right here. This is actually what we started out with, which were clearer tanks, opaque tanks, and we moved to using darker tanks because that protects against algae and it also helps with freezing. This was installed in the summer, so you don't see it here, but we've actually implemented covers as well. There's a platform because it's easier for people to haul the water. And then again, as I mentioned, with the 1,200 gallon cistern tanks, what we're doing are monthly water deliveries. And so again, we've moved to tens of locations across the Navajo Nation. And I want to show you a map here of what that looks like to give you an idea of how quickly we've had to get moving. So by the end of 2020, we'll do 840 of these tanks. We have a phenomenal staff. I really can't say enough, about how much hard work they're putting into it. And again, it's really important that when we have people who are working on the ground and who are from the community, that we're also taking care of them, because it can be really emotional. I mean, I have to share with you, I'm not a very emotional person, but there are times at night when I get home and it's like, you just think about what the day looked like. And it's so impactful to think that people are getting sick because they don't have this basic infrastructure. So, if you remember the blue dots, we went from those 3 locations, and this is where we're working now. We're starting to extend even further to the northeast. And I'd say the biggest challenge has been just keeping up with water deliveries. We've received $1 million in CARES Act from the Navajo Nation. And so we're working with the Navajo Nation government to ensure that we're getting more water trucks on the road. We just purchased 3. And we need to make sure that these are being maintained. A large problem that I often see, as a Navajo growing up on the res, but also as somebody working in the nonprofit sector, is a lot of times project starts and there's no operation and maintenance plan. And so things often fizzle out. Oftentimes technology is brought to the reservation that might not work. There seems to be a mentality a lot of times that projects that might work in developing countries will definitely be a copy and paste solution on the reservation, but every Native Nation is unique, and we need to make sure that we're designing these projects to be long-lasting, collaborative, and making sure that the community has these projects in their own hands. So to explain the water routes, again, this is something that the 1,200 gallon cisterns and the 275 gallons have in common, is they're filled up on a monthly basis. Here on the left, you can see what one of our watering points looks like. We also work with the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority and their watering points. They're about 57 across the Navajo Nation, many of which we rely on. It's all potable, safe water. They're tested regularly. And then here in the middle is basically what one of our normal tanks looks like. And then here on the right, this is something that we've had to outfit several trucks. We have a Ford F450 here, and then a darker tank again to protect against algae. And you can't really see here, but the road in the back of where the 1,400 gallon is pretty rough. And so you can imagine that these huge tankers here on the left have a hard time getting out to the rural communities. And again, as I mentioned, we're working with very off-grid families. And so these go out once a month, driven by our community partners and also CDL drivers that we have on staff. So the third element and the final element that I'll tell you of the COVID-19 work that we've been doing has really been the silver lining of all of this. I mentioned collaboration, which has really changed my life, and again, the way that I work in the water world. We have partnered with almost 20 collaborators. It's been really interesting to work with government entities because I've never really had that. From a personal point of view, I grew up with Indian Health Service, which is a federal agency of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I've never really had a positive relationship with them, I think. And again, I speak from a personal point of view, not from a DigDeep employee. And it's really changed because we've been working with some amazing people. I want to give a special shout out to David Harvey, who has really spearheaded this group. And it's been phenomenal to learn from all of these professionals. You know, a lot of times I work on the soft science side. A big part of my job is building relationships. And it's been amazing to work with different engineers, hydrologists, and really gain their knowledge. You know, the mission here is to identify, prioritize, and use existing water sources, but also to increase those. So as I mentioned, throughout the Navajo Nation, there are these different watering points. And what the Water Access Coordination Group has done is reopen some of these points, make sure that they're potable use, and that they're safe, and that there's hand washing stations there, and that it's accessible to people. Because why these are really important and why these are successful is because it's cutting down the amount of time that people have to travel to haul water. I really want to encourage everybody to visit the website down here, which is navajosafewater.org. And it's important because, you know, especially for those on this call who are from the Navajo Nation, there's a lot of really great information there about how you can get free storage tanks, how you can get chlorination tabs, and again, how you can use these water points and where they've been expanded to. So I really want to focus here on the last word, beyond. You know, the work that the Water Access Coordination Group, or WACG, has been working on doesn't just focus on COVID-19. It started out with that. You know, the Navajo Nation received a ton of press when things were pretty bad on the reservation. Things have sort of fizzled out. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world, but this is a problem that exists year round. COVID just highlighted this issue. And again, 30% of Navajos don't have running water, and it's really just been underlined. When we're moving ahead, it's important that we all work together. And so now we're talking about longer term projects, whether it's connecting people to water lines, or DigDeep continuing our work with off-grid families, assisting people with bill pay. But I mean, it's been a really hard reality to not install water in people's homes and to not do projects that we were doing previously. But it's also great to see that there's a path moving forward. I want to leave you with this video. It's one of my favorites, and I think it's a great example of what happens when we collaborate. Here you have Randy on the right, who is an amazing plumber from Green Bay, Wisconsin. He's from IWISH, which is the International Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene Foundation. And we've been working with them for several years now. They are an international entity, obviously, and they are a group of plumbers, welders, mechanical officials, and they usually work internationally, but started their first domestic projects with us on the reservation. And so a big portion of what our work was planned out to be in 2020 and is going to be pushed to 2021 and 2022 was installing septic systems. If you remember, I told you about the gray water drain fields that we did, but we want to do bathroom additions and make sure that people are getting sanitation within their homes. This video is of Emma Seaton, who's now 94. She lives in Natsitsan, which is the community that you saw, which is on the border of Utah and Arizona. And things are pretty difficult there because they're on the border. Obviously, they're in two different states. Oftentimes, funding will only go to one portion of the state, or it'll stop at the state line. And they're in 3 different counties, not to mention they need to work with the Navajo Nation and the federal government. And so oftentimes it's very difficult working here. But this was last summer when not only did she get a home water system, but working with IWISH, they were able to install a bathroom and septic. This video gives me a ton of hope, again, really focusing on the word beyond and thinking about how our team has transitioned overnight to be able to continue to get people safe water, just in a different capacity. But I'm really looking forward to when we can get back to this work, but I'm still so proud of the work that our team has done.
On behalf of IWISH and DigDeep, we would like you to try your water for the first time. If you could please turn it on. Oh, water. And hot water.
Thank you so much, Ikyahet. Here is my information, my email address, and then you can learn more about our website here. Again, also encouraging everybody, especially those on the Navajo Nation, to visit navajosafewater.org. And yeah, I am very happy to have shared all of that with you, and I'm now available to take questions.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. That was a very great video at the end. We have some very good questions from the audience, and I would like to present some of them to you. A lot of them have been upvoted, and so I'll start with those. The first one I'd like to ask comes from an anonymous attendee, and it says, as we think about water, COVID, Indigenous justice, and the other events of 2020, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can act in solidarity across marginalized groups while still valuing our unique heritages. How do we act together without falling into the trap of homogeneity, thinking both about the many distinct sovereign nations of Indigenous communities, sorry, they're moving as I'm talking, within the US, and also BIPOC groups across the world?
It's a super important question, and I think one that I'm still trying to figure out. You know, I approach this from being Indigenous myself and from being Diné, and really thinking about some of the principles of Dig Deep, and one of them being dignity, right? Not coming in with this white savior mentality, not coming in as, well, I hold this power and you're here, and so there's a different elevation of where we stand in our roles within this work. I think, you know, one thing that we talk a lot about is really investing time in the community that you're interested in, whether that's doing the actual work on the groundwork, or, you know, educating yourself as an ally or as an Indigenous person or as a BIPOC person, whoever you are. Oftentimes what we see is international NGOs will spend tons of money on getting to know communities that they're going to work in. But we see entities coming into different tribal nations, and there's not that same commitment. It's sort of like, okay, well, again, there's this copy and paste solution. So this is going to work in this part of the world. I think it's going to work here because there's not water. That's not the case. So I'd say in terms of standing in solidarity with people, it's really important to educate yourself, you know, understand how things came to be, whether that's, I mean, in my opinion, it's always based off of breaking treaties, but, you know, understanding why these systems exist, why Native nations are having issues. And then once you have that knowledge, sharing it with other people. I think these are things that you could like click on all day or get 1,000 books on and read about. And then also when we're designing these projects is not only taking the community into account, but knowing that it could potentially take years to build these relationships. Some of the sites that we've worked in, being from the reservation myself, oftentimes people think, well, you must have that connection because you're from the res. I mean, some of our project sites are 4 hours away from where I'm from. There's a completely different culture. We have different ways to say things in Navajo. There's different foods, there's different mentalities. And so I think it's important to know that everybody's unique, everybody has a different culture, and not just saying, okay, so you're a brown or black person, so everything is across the board the same. And it's something that it takes time to learn as well, and that there's not just one simple answer. For me, you know, as I mentioned, there are 2 million Americans in the United States who don't have piped water in their homes, and Dig Deep is now expanding to those communities in West Virginia, in the South, in Las Colonias along the border of Mexico and Texas, Central Valley in California, these are all different communities. Just because there is one underlying important factor that we don't have running water, it doesn't mean that we're all the same. And so I'd say educating yourself, realizing that every culture is different, even within one reservation, and just making sure that you can commit the time to really learning about those communities.
Thank you. That was great. This question kind of stems from that and applies it, to a global setting. We had a question of someone trying to start the same, or at least tackle the same problems as you in another country, and I would love to find this question. It says, I'm trying to see how I can donate water to some communities in Cameroon. It's quite difficult for me alone in this event, and it's so inspiring, your comments, and I think it'll go a long way to help me realize this project. I thought this was very interesting, even though it was more of a comment, because I'd love for you to touch on how in other parts of the world, people focusing on access to water and trying to improve access to water, how they can begin and how they can help their own communities.
Yeah, I'd say that's a great comment, and I'm very excited to hear that somebody's doing that. DigDeep's first project was actually in Cameroon and South Sudan. So I'd say if you want to hit me up, I can put you in contact with some of our project partners there. But that was, as I always say, BE, before Emma's time at DigDeep. So I can't speak specifically as to how we used to work internationally, but I know a really great thing is researching other entities that are working there. Obviously, water access in Cameroon is a huge issue. And so there are definitely people that are working there, whether it's drilling wells or doing water delivery or infrastructure building, and connecting with those communities and saying, this is what I'm interested in. There is definitely in the water world, again, everybody here knows that, a way of how we stand together in solidarity, and it's about working towards the same mission. So I'd say researching people who are in the community. You can hit me up and I can put you in contact with people that DigDeep has worked with. And also just, again, realizing that there might be a different solution than you have in mind. I think oftentimes, especially when we transition to COVID work, I came in thinking, oh, this is going to be really easy. We're just going to get out there, deliver water to people, whether it's bottled or the storage tanks. And, what we see is oftentimes the roads are washed out, or it's too icy to drive, or as I mentioned, the roads are too rough for a certain type of water truck. And I imagine that could be the same in Cameroon or other locations, and just realizing that you'll have to figure out these things. But yeah, just research things online and feel free to hit me up.
And I think you touched on an important point that, every space is different and everywhere you work comes with new challenges. And there's a related question that touches on, how the organization effectively scales its efforts based on, different areas. And also as you move through time, hopefully working with more and more families. How does this change if many of the solutions are customized to those areas and those individuals?
Yeah, I think, again, with the Navajo Nation getting so much press about water, we just saw like a wave of people coming into the reservation, and really great intentions, wanting to do really great work, wanting to partner, but it seemed like there was no long-term plan there. And I speak again as a Navajo who's from the reservation, who's from the western part of the reservation, where we have a ton of uranium contamination. And on top of it, we're in the Formant Bennett Freeze area, which means that there was a development ban from the 60s to 2009, which is one of the reasons why we don't have infrastructure, or why people don't have electricity, or why we couldn't make new businesses. And it's something where it's not about shaming those people, but it's about having conversations where you say, is this really going to be a long-term project? Is this really going to be something that you're going to be here for several years? I had a conversation with someone and they said, well, we're in it for the long haul. We're going to be here for 6 months. That was in May. I mean, 6 months is up now. And again, I really can't say enough that it's not about shaming people. It's just about saying, is this a commitment that you want to do? Because there's been so much broken trust on reservations specifically and in other marginalized communities that why would you continue to perpetuate that? As I mentioned in my presentation as well, oftentimes what we'll see is people will bring in technology that just won't work on the reservation. There's no one to maintain these systems. And, you know, when you come in knowing that and really saying like, I really have to be honest with myself because I don't want to overcommit to a community. They're hard conversations to have, to say to somebody, I'm probably not going to be able to do this. But wouldn't you rather have that conversation from the very beginning rather than start something and, for lack of a better way to say, half-ass the project and then say, you know, peace out, we're going, it's not working.
Thank you. That's great. This goes back to your infrastructure comment about, you know, there's areas where the infrastructure is just not there. This question says, I'm wondering how the US government, local government, and community leaders can work to build up infrastructure, to build water resilience and prepare for future challenges like COVID-19 and climate change. I know that's a big question, so you can answer it in parts.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, as I said, everything on Native nations gets back to broken treaties, right? Like there are almost 600 federally recognized tribes. That's not even counting state recognition or tribes who don't have recognition in the United States. Not one of the treaties that's been signed with those hundreds of nations has been, you know, honored. They've all been broken. And so in these treaties, we've been promised infrastructure by the federal government saying, you know, you give up these swaths of land, you give up your sovereignty in a lot of ways, and we're going to install water systems. That hasn't happened in a lot of cases. And, you know, I say this and it's sort of like, well, what's the call to action after that? How do we make sure that that happens? But it's about holding the federal government accountable and saying, you know, we gave you ABC, why aren't you giving us DEF? And you know, what that looks like is making sure that you research legislation that's going out there. Water rights in Utah on the Navajo Nation, we don't have any water rights. That's a huge thing, you know, pushing for that, calling your senators, calling your representatives and saying, these are communities that should be owning their own water rights. You know, I think also the new administration, the newly elected administration has released a water plan. I see politicians all the time who come in and say, well, we have these great plans for tribal nations. And it's like, we're campaigning off of it. I really hope that that actually is followed through. I'm not saying that it won't be followed through, but, you know, I encourage everyone to Google that. I don't remember the exact title of it. They did actually reference DigDeep's work, which was awesome to see. But again, I know that the newly elected president has a plan that's being laid out for getting water infrastructure on tribal nations. I think also, again, educating ourselves, it takes a ton of Googling. As our social media coordinator says, and as I always say, don't be frugal with your Google, arming yourself with that knowledge because you never know who you're going to come in contact with. I've done a congressional briefing, and if I go to other conferences, I always want to be able to reference certain things and say, this is like, look, like I have your ear, you're an Indian Health Service representative, you're a state legislature representative, like these are the things that we should really be looking towards. And I think also it's just, again, about sharing that knowledge with others because not everybody knows even what a treaty is, and not everybody can even fathom what a broken treaty is. And so, yeah, if you're as interested in treaties as I am, all of my artwork surrounds treaties. I'd also recommend looking up the Oklahoma State University archives. They have like every single treaty digitized. And it's really important if you want to learn more about why these problems exist from the very, very base.
Thank you. That was great. I wanted to touch on the theme of resilience, and as it's a theme of our water conference, as well as something that you've touched on in the communities. And I just wanted to get more specific, as well as there's a question here that I'll frame it in terms of a question from the participants. It's how does resilience work in overexploited landscapes? And I'd like to add on to that is, how would you define resilience in your experience? And also, would you explain the significance of being resilient in these situations? Because I think a lot of people don't understand that resilience is not always, it's not a choice. it's, you know, something that you have to do. And I was just wondering if you could touch on that in a Native American community.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the number one thing is being unapologetically Indigenous, right? Like, it's oftentimes when I'm having these conversations, I feel like I'm harping on being Indigenous, and I feel like I shouldn't have to remind people that I'm part of one of the most ignored communities throughout the world, let alone the United States. But just saying, like, I need to advocate for myself and I need to bring these issues to the forefront. Also, you know, again, I speak at this from both working in the NGO water section and the WASH world, but also as a Native American, because they go hand in hand. You know, being resilient is really just saying I'm existing. That in itself is resilient. We've been tried to be killed off and erased over hundreds of years, and it's not going to happen anymore. And so me just existing and raising my voice and saying, you know, whatever your platform is, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, whatever the kids use nowadays, I'm just kidding. But no, really, like whatever people use, you know, whether it's you have a blog or you have an opportunity to write an op-ed, saying whatever community you're from, but speaking specifically about Natives, is, you know, these are things that we need. Like, we need basic infrastructure like running water. This is not something that needs to wait. It's not something that can wait. And again, the pandemic has highlighted that. So being resilient by just saying, I'm Native, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. These are the issues that I'm demanding. I'm going to do it in an educated way. I'm going to do it in a way that's going to reach a lot of people. And I think once you have that down, it's saying in the community, we have to work with partners that are on the ground, because we're not going to be able to be resilient. We're not going to be able to put these projects in the hands of people, which is not an easy thing. It's not just like you hand these off and say, I'm going to assume that you have money to run the water truck, or I'm going to assume that you have the money to maintain the system so they're not freezing, as I mentioned. But, you know, coming up with a plan, and again, understanding that these take like years to work out the kinks, because DigDeep is one of the only organizations working in the WASH sector domestically and on reservations and in other communities, that it takes a commitment, not only from one person, but from the project partners. It takes research. And so once you have that, you're really arming yourself to be resilient. And I think also just figuring out where you sort of fit into the puzzle piece, because everybody has such an important role, no matter whether it's researching and sharing information, whether it's going out and installing home water systems, whether it's studying at MIT in hydrology or engineering or anywhere else. But it's important that we all come together, because we need to work together as a unit. Only one person can't do as much as even just two people can.
I think that is a very important point, and that is kind of the theme of this whole conference. We like to bring people together in order to talk about these issues. I have a more specific question. It says, hi, Emma, great presentation. This is Mac Prather. Sorry for my pronunciation if that's incorrect. With Engineers Without Borders Community Engineering Corps. I'm curious about the challenges you mentioned regarding operations and management. Could you explain some of the issues with operations and management and some success of what has worked for keeping services up and running?
Yeah, that's a great question. Also, I love EWB. Hello, Matt. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, there are very minor things like figuring out freezing. And it's not minor because it can, you know, stop somebody from getting running water, but it's something where it could be as simple as saying, well, we're going to put heat trace tape on. Well, again, not everybody has electricity, and that might not work for a solar powered system. So we do have a field engineer. I'll say my life has gotten a lot easier since Caitlin came on board, because there's someone who's dedicated to working on those things. You know, again, like my background is in the arts. It's not to say that I don't know things about water or I haven't learned a lot of things when it comes to problem solving, but making sure that we have someone there who's actually able to focus on those issues is great. But water freezing has been an issue. Maintaining roads has been an issue, because we can't get this water truck from point A to point B if we don't have a safe way to get drivers there. Excuse me, making sure that we have data collection is a huge issue on reservations, whether that means, you know, accurately mapping out somebody's home and having GPS points, or if that means, you know, okay, this is at a high elevation, we're going to have to figure out how to install a pressure tank to make sure that the water is running smoothly. And then on a level of making sure that these projects can go back in the hands of community partners, been a really big challenge, and it always comes down to money, right? And making sure that we're not just saying, you know, here's this fancy water truck, it requires all this maintenance. I mean, there's not much that it requires, but you know, insurance, even a tire went out, do you have the money for it? And coming up with solutions where it's like, well, how can we work this into your budget? Or how do we have a transition plan? Because it's not just like you're going to hand over this thing to somebody else. Also making sure that we're hiring people who are in the community and leaving them with knowledge and with certifications like CDLs or plumbing certifications, and that they're people who are not only committed, but who are armed with knowledge to be able to make sure that things function. As I mentioned, we also work with one nonprofit, and I've actually done a project with another nonprofit in a special needs school where we replumbed it. Working with nonprofits is a little bit easier than working with local government. And again, it just comes down to fundraising models and budgets and who you need to answer to. But yeah, if anybody has any suggestions ever about any of this, or wanting to talk more about where they've been successful in working with community members, I mean, more specifically like a full entity, and how they've been able to hand off those projects smoothly, I'd love to hear that at some point. You have my email address. Again, I know it's a long conversation. But yeah, it ranges from the little things to like the big ideas.
Great. Another specific question, I think this is a clarification question, but it's important to address. Someone asked about water rights, and I think that's important to address. Could you please explain what that is and how that affects the access to water and the infrastructure that you deal with?
Yeah, I'd say honestly, it's not like my strongest point. So I don't want to speak like too out of line, just being like extremely honest. And also, during the past couple months, there have been developments in Utah specifically that I haven't been able to keep up with just with COVID work. I think all of us on our team work well over 40 hours. So I don't have a lot of time to research it. But I'd say, again, there are many specific issues in Utah. A really complicated thing is just the Navajo Nation being in 3 different states, and there being different laws and legislation in every single state. But you know, there's actually a lot of water on the Navajo Nation, like groundwater and different aquifers. It's just we don't always have the ability to access it.
Thank you. There's a couple questions, and I'm going to try to summarize them into one, which might not work out as well as I'm hoping. But a lot of people are asking about, you know, next steps and future goals, and what ideas are there to move forward in order to have sustainable solutions. And that's including for communities, livestock, agriculture, as well as, you know, the future steps in places where you have already installed some of your new infrastructure. And so I was wondering if you could touch on, you know, where you plan to move after the COVID crisis and with the COVID crisis.
Yeah, I'm glad that agriculture and livestock and farming was brought up just now, because you know, that's such a huge part of our traditional culture, and we need to make sure that we as different people are addressing that. I say different people as in different entities, the Navajo Nation individuals. DigDeep works only with potable water, but it's also about directing people to different areas and saying, you know, this is where you can get water for your livestock. It's really sad, but a lot of times when I'm working in more off-grid areas, sometimes we'll see that there are like horses that are dying of thirst, or there are sheep that are in desperate need of it. Because, you know, another big problem is we see that a lot of our homeowners that we're working with will say, well, I'd rather give my livestock water than get it myself. And that's a big thing because sheep are such a big part of our culture. So moving forward, it's been a really interesting set of conversations, and there have been a lot of really hard ones. We have an amazing research manager, Katie Jans, always giving her shout outs for the work that she does. But she's put a lot of effort into researching safety and what we're going to do. I mean, you have to remember we're working inside of homes and in smaller homes. And there's a second wave of COVID on the Navajo Nation. Last week, we had 158 cases in one day. And so it's been a really big thing to figure out how to move forward. We are now planning on extending the 275-gallon storage tank drops until the end of February. And right now we're coming up with plans as to how we can either install systems safely, or how we can modify our systems to be outdoors until it's safe to go into homes. I think I'm very much of the, Fauci mentality of this won't be over until 2022. And we need to keep our homeowners safe. We need to keep our staff safe. And we need to just make sure that we're setting a good example. It's not just like you go into someone's house, you put on a KN95 and, everything's cool. We're in there for hours. We need to educate people. We're interacting with them. So, again, I mentioned our field engineer who's doing a lot of stuff is really great, because we just need to reimagine what our systems look like. And also, again, collaborating with these different groups that are saying we're hooking people up to main water lines. So where do we fit into that puzzle piece? Is it funding? Is it coming out and helping surveying? And then also, again, like I mentioned, sanitation is something that we were really planning on doing in 2020, but making sure that we're doing that successfully. And it's not just like, let's throw in a bathroom and there we go. There's no maintenance plan.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna ask one more question and then we'll go to a break. I would like to bring up Native American Heritage Month, and I'd like to have you speak about the importance of that, as well as extending that, to recognize the community throughout all months of the year. What can we do in the communities surrounding and throughout, the United States and the world to learn more about this and to support their fight against the issues regarding water access?
Yeah, Native American Heritage Month doesn't just have to be November 1st through November 30th. I'd really encourage everybody to realize that it's amazing that we have a month to learn about Native peoples and Indigenous peoples. But, maybe what that sparks is learning about water issues on reservations. You've obviously heard about water issues on the reservation, not only problems, but solutions. And, researching movements like what's going on in Wet'suwet'en right now with the Wet'suwet'en movement of water issues there. It's on the US, but it's in Canada. Looking into what's going on in the Midwest and different water issues there. And then also saying, I'm committing to not only educating myself about this, but to looking into different entities and saying, I'm going to make sure that I'm fighting for someone who isn't myself. I think, again, we talked about one person being able to do a lot, but a lot of people can do a lot. And I think as Indigenous peoples, it's really important that we bind together. Standing Rock was such a huge thing for us because we were able to come together, but we can't do these things if we don't have allies either. Just because you're not Native American doesn't mean that you can't take part in fights for Native Americans. This is not water related, but I'd also say it is, but I'd also say a big part of what you can do during Native American Heritage Month is knowing whose land you're on, right? Like whose land you're occupying. I mentioned that I'm on Tongva land in Los Angeles. I'm a visitor to this land. Also find out, what land you're on, because once you know that, you're also going to be able to understand a lot more water issues. And then also just, I'd say, there's so many events going on in November, tuning into that, because one thing that you might not think could be related to water or to anything else that you're interested in can sort of like spark this other thing to encourage you to look into other things. But I think, again, everything that's been going on in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement and other really important social justice events and movements have really sparked other Native American movements, like just a billion things. And so once you get into that little rabbit hole, it takes you further. Again, I really want to say not only to learn about the problems and the issues that we're facing, but also the solutions that exist.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. That was an amazing talk and some really good questions from the audience, and I really appreciate hearing your perspective. You can connect with Emma on Instagram, and I think you posted the link on your slide. It's her name, but with a ZL at the end. And you can visit her website, emmarobbins.com. At this time, we're going to take a short break in which you can feel free to get up, take a stretch, look away from your screen, You can also enter our Zoom break room. We have a separate Zoom, and I will send the link in the chat. There you can go and feel free to discuss some of the topics that were spoken about. And at this time, I want to say thank you, Emma, and we can go on the break.
Oh, shoot. I think it's okay. I think, can you try seeing if the video can be turned on?
Can you see my break screen?
Yeah, I see the, well, I'm on the webinar, so.
Okay, let me change you to host.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon,
All right.
or morning for us, but
Can people see if they can put their, turn their video on or?
I will do that for them. One second.
Okay.
Yes, the host.
Can you guys turn it
stopped
on
your
now?
video. I can.
Great. And Chunman, I just made you the host.
Okay.
And once we get everyone's videos on, I will go ahead and log off.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for 2 more people. So I have the slides. I will run the slides, and Cornel, the polling is there.